Okay, hello Ling 201. We're back for another round of phonology, and as promised, we are going to talk a little bit about superheroes today. So, with that in mind, I have a fun little cartoon here that I got from a friend a long time ago about I guess, an artist who made a fancy drawing of Superman out of a kid's drawing of Superman. So you can enjoy that while it lasts on the screen, I guess. And before we get into the content of today's lecture, I do want to let you know that there's a quick write associated with it as well. It's quick write number 16, if hopefully we're keeping track with the numbers. All right. It's about Hawaiian Creole English, or Hawaiian Creole in general, which I will explain in detail or in some detail later on in this lecture. But what I want you to look at are these words from English that have been borrowed into Hawaiian Creole, and try to figure out what sort of phonological changes have happened to the sounds in the English words. So they're originally English, but they're pronounced in a different way in this particular language, Hawaiian Creole. So I want you to explain how those changes, what those changes are, and what sort of contexts and situations they're relevant to. As best as you can, we'll talk about this later in the lecture and try to go over the various answers to that. There's a lot in there, so you can take a few minutes to figure that out, but not too much, just get a sense of what's going on there. There's also some vowel changes, but I want you to focus on sort of the consonantal changes in these, so give that a shot, please. And hopefully it'll help enrich what we're going to talk about today, and also help phonology make a little more sense than it has before. So to get back into it, what I want to do is kind of pick up where we left off last time. We're kind of in the middle of where we left off last time. So I talked sort of towards the end of a previous lecture about distributions of sounds in a language. And I said that a distribution is simply the collection of phonetic environments in which a sound may appear. And for this class, at least, you can think about the phonetic environment as the sound surrounding the phoneme or allophone in question, or the phone in question when we do a phonological analysis problem. And I'll show you some examples again on the next couple of slides, but there are two basic kinds of distributions that we talked about, a basic distinction between a contrastive distribution, where you can have two sounds that appear in the same phonetic environment, and then there's a complementary distribution where the two sounds don't appear in the same phonetic environment. So when two sounds are in contrastive distribution, they appear in the same phonetic environment, and they can change the meaning of a word, so they can contrast with one another. And when that happens, the two sounds are allophones of different phonemes, or you can just say they're different phonemes altogether, because on the surface they're different and they make a meaningful difference. That means that underlyingly, at an abstract level, they make contrast in meaning between two words. So that's kind of a simple case. We see that whenever we get minimal pairs, we just know that there are two sounds that are different in a language for that reason. A little more complicated case, which winds up being a little more fun case as well, if you are a linguist, is when you get complementary distribution. So for this, I kind of wanted to go back to this example we saw at the end of last lecture with the Japanese fricative sounds H, H, and F. So we had three different phones at the surface level, and we're trying to figure out what kind of distribution they have with respect to one another. So the first one we'll look at is the H, the voiceless palatal fricative, and I've tried to highlight the distribution of this creature in the way that I was kind of doing in an ad hoc or impromptu way in the previous lecture. So I bolded the appearances of the H here in Japanese, and then I've also put the phonetic environment for, or the distribution of this sound in blue in this particular case. And I've added a bit of a detail here to the previous lecture, which is that at the beginning of the word, I put this sort of hashtag or tic-tac-toe symbol, the pound symbol, whatever you want to call it, which is the notation that is typically used in phonology to denote the beginning of a word. So there's no sound here. Hito is simply the word for person in Japanese. So ha is the initial sound in the word. But to describe that environment, the phonetic environment where it begins a word, you say, well, this hashtag is the beginning of the word hito. So ha can be found in between the beginning of a word and e. You could just as well put one of these hashtags or tic-tac-toe symbols at the end of each word as well. That's used as the notation for describing the end of a word in phonology. I'm not doing that because it turns out that in Japanese you can never get a fricative at the end of a word. The only consonant you can get at the end of the word and at the end of a word in Japanese is n. Otherwise, there's always vowels there, but you're never going to get ha or fa, whatever. So I'm going to just skip that for now. That's another just kind of interesting phonological fact about Japanese, but let's just focus on these three fricatives and potentially the beginning of the word in these cases. But the blue environment is the environment for ha. And the one thing that is in common among all three of these examples is that the ha is followed by an e. Sometimes it's at the beginning of the word, but here it's in the middle, preceded by an ah. Then if we look at the environment for the F, I've got F bolded here, and then F's environment is in green. And I'm sorry I'm not being consistent with the color notation as before, but I'm doing my best here. Anyways, F sometimes appears at the beginning of a word, sometimes at the middle, but what's consistent about F is that it's always followed by the vowel oo. And then if we look at the environment for the H, we see sometimes it's at the beginning of a word, sometimes it's at the middle, and there's no consistent vowel after it either, so it has a variety of different phonetic environments in which it can be found. But the vowels after it are interesting because it can be A or O or Ah, but it's never these other two vowels which were consistent between the other two fricatives, E or Oo. So from that, we know that these three sounds are in complementary distribution in Japanese. So when sounds are in complementary distribution, they never appear in the same phonetic environment. Or another way to put it is that they appear in non-overlapping environments. They're distinct from each other. So ha, ha, and fa are in complementary distribution in Japanese. Ha appears before the vowel E, f appears before the vowel oo, and h, ha, appears before all the other vowels. When this happens, then we can infer from the situation that the sounds which are in complementary distribution are allophones of the same phoneme. So that means we have some underlying phoneme which is the same for all three of these sounds. It just appears as each one of these sounds in different contexts. The phoneme changes shape is another way to put it. It changes its phonetic shape depending on its phonetic environment. This is kind of a funny concept to get into your head if it doesn't make intuitive sense. So a significant part of today's lecture is going to be an analogy that linguists and phonologists like to use for this sort of situation, which hopefully will be helpful for you. And if it's not, just sit back and enjoy the ride, I guess, because this is going to be about Batman. So way back when, one of the first times I taught this class at the University of Calgary, if you remember, the first quick write is a class census where I ask you to tell me a little bit about yourself. And in this particular class, 11 years ago, I actually had Batman, or Bruce Wayne rather, as a student in my class, if you can believe it. And he told me all these things about himself, which is pretty interesting. I don't know why he was taking linguistics, but presumably it will help him in his sort of personal or crime-fighting endeavors. The analogy, however, why I'm talking about Batman is that Batman kind of provides a way to talk about complementary distribution. Yeah, I'm going to walk you through it with Batman and then say a few things about it afterwards. But, you know, if you know the sort of Batman mythology, the whole comic book universe for, I can't even remember what his nickname is, but the Batman, the Prince of Darkness, I doubt it. Anyways, Commissioner Gordon runs the police department in Gotham City, and he knows a couple of guys pretty well. One of them is Batman, and one of them is Bruce Wayne. And then at sometimes he realizes when he stops to think about it that he never sees the two of them together in the same place at the same time. Isn't that kind of funny? So in fact, one of them, Batman, really only shows up in certain situations. And you can kind of think about this as like the distribution of the two people. So Batman will appear when like the Joker is on a crime spree, or the Penguin has kidnapped the mayor's daughter, or Catwoman just broke out of jail, so on and so forth. or there's a major motion picture to be made. But Bruce Wayne appears when there's like a philanthropy convention because Bruce Wayne is a very rich man, or the auto show is in town. He likes to hang out with the rich and famous, or he's jogging in Central Park, so on and so forth. So these two appear in different situations. And since the commissioner is in charge of the police, he often needs Batman's help when there's a crime problem going on. So he knows him from that, but he knows Bruce Wayne because he's rich and powerful as well, too, right? But there are different distributions for the two people, and we can kind of think about what situations the two appear in. So, like, is there anything in common in these sort of Batman environments? Like the Joker is on a crime spree, the Penguin has kidnapped the mayor's daughter, Catwoman just broke out of jail, etc. You could say, yeah, there is something in common there. They're all crime-fighting situations. It's sort of like, oh, look at this. I keep seeing F in Japanese, and there's always an oo after F. What's up with that? Well, whenever I see Batman, there's always some sort of crime problem happening. Or maybe I sent out the bat signal. Who knows? But look at these environments for Bruce Wayne, like philanthropy convention, the auto shows in town, jogging in Central Park. Yeah, I mean, they're all common to Gotham City maybe, but other than that, there's really nothing going on there that links them all together. So you can kind of think of those as like non-crime fighting situations. You never see a crime problem when Bruce Wayne is around. In a crime problem situation, you see Batman instead. Just to let you know, these other situations which don't seem to have anything in common, even though these do, sometimes they're referred to as like elsewhere. So like everywhere else besides the crime problem situation, we see Bruce Wayne. So he's elsewhere besides Batman. But we never see the two together. Isn't that funny? So Bruce Wayne and Batman, if you are willing to be patient with this analogy, they're in complementary distribution. So they never appear together in the same place at the same time. And I've got another sort of extremely fancy Venn diagram here to show you how this works with, by the way, the real Batman from the 60s TV show. You can forget about Christian Bale or whoever else. But here's Bruce Wayne in these other situations, and then Batman appears here whenever there are other like criminals around. So he dons his mask and has to get to work. Okay, yeah. Given two sounds in a language, I'm going to ask you to sort of entertain me by trying to treat them like Batman and Bruce Wayne. And your goal is to figure out whether they're meaningfully different sounds. So like in the Batman and Bruce Wayne situation, we want to figure out if they're meaningfully different people. We might suspect, well, we don't see them in the same place at the same time. Is that just a coincidence? Or like maybe they're the same person underlyingly, and we never realized that before because Batman's costume is so amazingly like deceptive, right? Who could possibly figure out that this is Bruce Wayne? Not Commissioner Gordon. He's only the head of the police. Anyways, the goal with those two, if you're in like some sort of sitcom situation, is to try to force the two people into the same situation together, like maybe by inviting them to the same party, and then crazy hijinks ensue. And it's fun and entertaining times for everybody who watches the show. In the case of sounds, though, what you want to do is to see if they ever appear in the same phonetic environment. Like we've noticed in Japanese, like, oh, we keep getting an oo after the sound F. That's funny. Can we get an H before an oo? Does that work or not? And so we could try. You could ask, say, a Japanese speaker to say that sequence of sounds, or you could say it yourself and see what they think about it, if it sounds like it's genuine Japanese to them or not. There are different ways to try to figure out if underlyingly they're the same sound, same phoneme, or if they're just allophones of the same, or if they're contrastive or allophones of the same phoneme. So again, continuing with the analogy, what you want to do is to describe what kind of phonetic environment each sound appears in. So figure out if there's anything in common among the various phonetic environments in which each sound appears. And if you can't find anything in common between two different sounds, if the two sounds never appear in the same phonetic environment, they're in complementary distribution. And then you can assume that they're allophones of the same phoneme. That's just by looking at the data you have in front of you. So part of this and part of what's fun for linguists is that, if you're good at seeing patterns, then if, you can kind of guess that there's a pattern in the language pretty quickly, and eventually you can kind of test it to see if that pattern holds for like new words or new data that you might not have in front of you. But if you just have a small set of data and you see what looks like a pattern, then go for it. I kind of like to joke that linguists like to jump to conclusions because it's true, and therefore I'd kind of like recommend that you jump to conclusions in this class, and then try to prove yourself wrong, basically, based on a conclusion you have from like a small set of data. So if you see like, well, I've got two forms where F appears in front of oo, maybe there's a pattern there. So then just keep looking for like anything else that it might appear in front of an oo. Is it always going to be an F, or could it be a different fricative in a language like Japanese? If you can't prove yourself wrong, if you have sort of a set pattern where the two sounds appear in different environments, then they're in complementary distribution, they're allophones of the same phoneme, and then what you need to do is figure out what phoneme is changing into what in what particular environment. So in the Batman example, you've got Batman only appearing in crime-fighting situations. So Batman is, in a sense, the restricted allophone, or as I'm putting it here, he's the restricted allo person. We're only going to see him in certain situations. Otherwise, we're going to see Bruce Wayne, who's in all of the elsewhere situations, so-called. So this goes back to this distinction between a restricted allophone and a basic allophone. Basically, when I'm saying that Bruce Wayne and Batman are allo people of the same person, that means that there's one person, we can call him Bruce Wayne, and then he changes into Batman in these certain crime-fighting situations, right? So Bruce Wayne is the basic allo person because he appears in a wider variety of situations, like jogging or auto shows or what have you. Likewise, in Japanese, F is the Batman, or at least we'll just focus on F for now and forget about the H. So H appears in a wider variety of contexts. It appears before the vowels A, A, and O, so it's the basic allophone. F only appears before oo. I'm not going to say that oo is like causing crimes, but if you want to think about oo as causing crimes, that's okay. That's not going to hurt its feelings. So F only appears before oo. That makes it the restricted allophone. And what happens in phonology when you have allophones of the same phoneme, where one just appears in particular phonetic environments, then it's the basic allophone changing into a restricted allophone. In the Batman example, Bruce Wayne is the basic person. He changes into Batman in these certain contexts. So, in general, you can assume the basic allophone is the representation of the underlying phoneme, and the appearance of the restricted phoneme is conditioned by its environment. And the way you write a rule for this is that you say that the basic allophone in slashes changes into the restricted allophone in square brackets, and then you draw a slash and figure out how to describe the conditioning environment. So the underscore part of this just shows you where this phoneme is appearing in the environment, and in this particular case, like H changing into F, it appears before oo. I'm kind of having to stretch this analogy a little bit here, as if I haven't stretched it enough already, but Bruce Wayne is the underlying phoneme person, and he changes to Batman, and then we're just saying this is where he appears in the context of crime-fighting situations. Don't worry too much about this formalism. If you can understand this, then you are good to go. And I'll just mention as well, just so it's clear, like there could be some other language, not Japanese, but it's possible that F might appear only after the vowel, I don't know, O or something, right? So if that were the case, then you draw the environment like this. So like this other languages, we'll call it Bloblish, whatever. H changes to F after an O, and this is how you say after an O in this notation, just so you know. I'm going to erase this now, so hopefully you got that, because let's just focus on the Japanese example here. All right, I'm going to put an end to that analogy for now. Actually, I will say one more thing, because as long as we're being silly, we might as well be complete as well. Normally, when phonologists talk about this particular analogy, they like to use the example of Superman, which is where this cartoon came from here. Because, Superman is Clark Kent. And Clark Kent and Superman have a similar relationship to Bruce Wayne and Batman. I guess, classic cartoons, there's only so much creativity to go around. But one of the reasons I don't like to use Superman is because Superman actually has a third identity. For you nerds out there, you know this, but when he was on his home planet of Krypton, he was called Kal-El. So there's 3 different ways to be that person, Superman or Clark Kent, whoever he is. And so that's a little bit like this Japanese phoneme, which changes into 3 different shapes or has 3 different appearances, depending on its context. Not that Superman can ever go back to Krypton, but hopefully you know what I'm talking about. So it's a little bit simpler to think about Batman because it's just 2 guises for that guy. And that kind of goes back to that example I was giving you of yourself or whoever you might know, because you probably appear in different ways to different people in different contexts, right? And I gave you the example of, if you're hanging out with your friends versus when you go to work, but you probably present yourself even a little bit differently if you're at school, if you go to church, if you go to the doctor, wherever. There's different ways to be yourself, and maybe the entire story of everybody or everything, or who you are in completeness, but for the rest of us, we just see kind of you in one particular guise in a particular environment, and part of who you are is kind of conditioned by the way people normally act in that environment. I don't think I've ever actually shown this video in class, but I think of it often. But this is from Dave Chappelle, the comedian from a while back. And this is kind of talking about that idea in a broader sense than just phonology, but I think it's relevant here. So I'll give this a shot, and maybe this will help explain the analogy as well.
Every Black American is bilingual. All of them. We speak street vernacular, and we speak job interview. There's a certain way I gotta speak to have access. If I'm sitting across the table from a studio exec, sometimes they'll do it to me. Say, my man, what's happening? I say, hold up, no. And I gotta throw out them big words. I gotta let them know that my parents are probably smarter than your parents.
Yeah. And much better educated.
They're much better educated than your parents, but they may not have had the access that your parents had. But this is show business. I can climb that socioeconomic ladder just off the merit of my skills. I can talk that shit. It's a God-given gift. So, I speak in street vernacular because when I'm talking to an audience of people, I feel comfortable. It's like an extension. Really, crowds are like my friends. It's the most consistent part of my life since I was 14. But in certain situations, I gotta...
I understand.
I gotta use that job interview. Well, I don't like that deal.
Okay, so Dave Chappelle's talking at a broader sense of like how you change the way you speak, from his particular experience as a Black actor. And that's more about, sort of more formal language versus less formal language. Is one way to think about it. But this is, when we're talking about phonology, we're talking about sort of more specific phonetic detail, how that changes in particular environments, not based on sort of the social situation, but rather on the sort of just phonetic situation or the phonetic environment in which a sound will find itself. And a lot of these changes get made, it seems like, to make things a little bit easier to say, or maybe sometimes a little bit easier to understand. But that doesn't really matter. We just need to be able to describe the changes formally that are happening to sounds in a language. But a sound, any individual sound, can have sort of different appearances on the surface. And we have to figure out sort of what the unity is behind those changes. Okay, so let's think about the other distribution situation. So what happens if you find 2 different sounds in the same environment? So there's 2 possibilities here. I just mentioned one before. So the first one that I mentioned is that the 2 sounds can be in contrastive distribution. That we know is the case if those 2 sounds contrast between the meanings of different words, like in a minimal pair. There's also another possibility here, which, yeah, kind of makes this whole thing a little bit messy, but you should know about it anyways. So it's possible that the two sounds can be in what's called free variation. And in this case, they are not going to change the meaning of the words. And it's kind of funny because it just means that there's no meaningful difference between those sounds. And there's not really anything that conditions that either from the environment. It's just that the speaker has the option of using one or the other. So this is free variation. Two different sounds appear in the same environment, but they don't change the meaning of the word. A kind of classic example of this, which is given in a lot of phonetics textbooks, is this difference between a released stop or an unreleased stop at the end of a word, like kit versus kit. Is there a little puff of air after the end of that T at the end of the word, kit, or is there not, kit? That doesn't change the meaning of the word at all. You can say it either way in English, and it should be fine with respect to whether or not your listener understands you. But that's a really subtle distinction, which most people don't kind of get right off the bat. What it means in this particular case, though, is that even though these two sounds or two phones are appearing in the same environment, because they don't change the meaning of the word, that means they're allophones of the same phoneme. We just can't write a rule to describe when you get one or the other. Or if there is some sort of rule, it's, something really subtle or subconscious that is hard to kind of pin down rather than the sounds that are around it in the word. So the idea is there are free variations, so you can freely substitute one for the other. Another example, which may be a little more salient, I talked about distinctions like versus open o. So this depends on the dialect of English you speak. In Canadian English, most speakers don't have a distinction between and o. So you'd say thought, however you say it. Other dialects of English, it would make a meaningful difference. Like if you have the male name Don versus the female name Dawn. You wouldn't want to make this change in free variation in those dialects, but if you're a speaker of sort of most varieties of Canadian English, you can change between the two of them and it doesn't make a difference. So you can say thought, you can say thought, and it still means the same thing. Hopefully you can hear that distinction a little bit. Thought. It sounds a little bit different, but it's the same word, right? That's free variation. I'll give you another example. Going back to the show 30 Rock, and the actress Tina Fey, and hopefully you can pick up on this one. So I'll let you watch the video first, and I want to ask you to pay close attention to how she's pronouncing things, and maybe you'll hear the example of free variation that I noticed in this particular sequence.
How was your evening with Thomas?
You mean Gretchen Thomas, the brilliant plastics engineer / lesbian? What made you think I was gay?
Your shoes.
Well, I'm straight.
Those shoes are definitely bi-curious.
Regardless, I am straight. 100% completely straight.
All right. Maybe you picked up on that. This is why it's fun to be a linguist, because you just pay attention to how people are saying things and not what they say. But she says the word straight 3 times in this particular sequence. And we'll walk through it again. Listen to how she says straight each time.
How was your evening with Thomas?
You mean Gretchen Thomas, the brilliant plastics engineer / lesbian? What made you think I was gay?
Your shoes.
Well, I'm straight.
Those shoes are definitely bi-curious.
Regardless, I am straight. 100% completely straight.
All right, so she says straight 3 times. Maybe I can squeeze them in here. So the first time she says straight, like that. And then she says straight, like that. And then she says straight again the 3rd time. So what's in free variation here is the sound at the beginning of the word straight. I guess I can give you the gloss, as we call it. that's how it's spelled, right? So you'd expect it to be pronounced with an S at the beginning, and maybe you pronounce it that way. Maybe you pronounce it the straight way. Either way, that can change back and forth in that particular context and still mean the same thing. So this is kind of funny. Normally, we'd think of S and esh as contrastive phonemes in English. In most environments they are, because we talked about there's a lot of different minimal pairs we can find for those two. In this particular context, though, a growing trend in English is to pronounce the S as an esh. I guess I can walk you through the phonetics of that a little bit. As I mentioned, when we're talking about phonetics, it's important to think of an sound as post-alveolar. It's a little bit further back in the mouth than an S normally is. And what's happening here is that post-alveolar place of articulation is kind of bleeding backwards towards the S. So it makes this T usually a little bit further back too. You can make a T. You can kind of curl your tongue tip back to make a tr sound. If it's next to an R, it makes it a little bit easier to say trait, tree. And then if that T is a little bit further back, then the S might become a little bit further back too, to a post-alveolar place of articulation. There's a commonality here amongst all those places of articulation. Like I said, this is kind of a change which has happened, or it seems to be growing over the past 20 years or so, which is the time span in which I've known about it. And one funny thing about sound changes in language is that younger female speakers usually tend to be on the vanguard, or in the vanguard of making those changes. So they do it first, everybody else starts to copy them over time. Either way, esh and s are in free variation in that particular context. And I'll give you another sort of example of s and esh going back to Japanese in what's called Loanword Phonology. So this is looking at another way to try to figure out what's going on maybe behind the scenes in phonology. So you can kind of look at what we call the psychological reality, like what's going on in a speaker's head. Of phonology is to look at how sounds change in words that are borrowed from another language. So in these cases, the underlying phoneme is just the original sound in the original language, and maybe I can put that text in here as well. So if you remember when I was talking about the sort of ridiculous Batman example, I said, if you suspect that like Batman and Bruce Wayne are the same person, like you could try to invite them to the same party, and then see what happens if they actually appear at the same time together. And then I was saying, well, in Japanese, we notice that like F only appears in front of U. Like, could we put an H in front of U? Would that work in Japanese? And you can try to force that to happen and see what a Japanese speaker says. I'm going to use a slightly different example, going back to our original one here, and say, well, we know like Japanese has borrowed some words from English. What happens when they borrow a word which has S in front of an E? So if you remember that rule, Japanese consistently has esh in front of E, and then it has S in front of all the other different vowels. But what happens when a Japanese speaker tries to say an English word like seafood in Japanese? So in the ideal sense, this S should remain an S even though it's in front of an E. We're trying to force that S into the same environment where an esh is normally found in Japanese. But it turns out that the way it's pronounced in Japanese is shifudo. So it changes, right? We can't get both of those sounds into the same environment. Or cinema is shinima in Japanese. Citibank is shitibanku, which kind of makes it sound like they don't like Citibank, but we'll just ignore that. Zip code is jipu kodo. So it turns out something similar happens with the Z phoneme in English. It starts out as alveolar, but in front of an E sound in Japanese, it turns into a post-alveolar fricative, just like an esh. So there's a commonality there, which is kind of cool. And then if you go the opposite way, so take an esh and put it in front of a vowel where it normally does not appear in English or Japanese, will it stay an esh? And it turns out the answer is no. That just gets interpreted as this S phoneme, so it becomes sepado. Again, excuse my Japanese, but it's something like that. The important part is this sequence here. So in Japanese, there's only one phoneme here for these two surface fricatives, and we can think of them underlyingly as an S, and they just change to an esh in front of an e. And we can kind of see that in terms of how English pronunciation changes going into Japanese. That's called loanword phonology. This brings me to the quick write today, which is about Hawaiian Creole, or what might be called Hawaiian Creole English. And to kind of set the stage for that, I want to say a little bit about what are called Pidgins or Creoles as a form of language. So this is something that occurs in a really interesting situation where people happen to be in the same environment where they don't speak some common language and they have to figure out how to communicate. So this happened, fairly often back in the, good old days or bad old days, depending on how you look at it, of hundreds of years ago, where, say, people were colonizing the world and encountering new peoples who didn't speak the same language, and they had to figure out how to communicate. So one option that happens when you do that, so like if you've ever gone abroad to a place where they don't speak English, you have to figure out maybe how to speak in their language. Or if they do speak in English, you're probably going to speak in English yourself. You can also, in some cases, use what's called a lingua franca. So generally speaking, around the world, English has become a lingua franca, which means that it's a common second language, which most people speak. As you might guess from the name, French used to serve that purpose in a lot of situations as well, which is kind of where this terminology comes from. It doesn't have to be, a European language like that, though. So in a lot of parts of Africa, Swahili functions as a lingua franca. So people in a lot of different countries in Africa speak one of a family of languages called a Bantu language. And Swahili is one Bantu language, but there are many of them. So if you know one, it's relatively easy to pick up Swahili too. And then so if you encounter somebody who speaks a different language natively, then you can speak Swahili with one another. And that functions as your common form of communication. It's interesting. So a lot of Africa back in the day was colonized by either English or French. So a lot of Africans can be trilingual, speak like a tribal language, which is spoken by just a small number of people that they know in their everyday life. And then they might speak Swahili too, and then maybe English or French on top of that. The interesting case that I want to talk about, though, is what happens when a pidgin gets created. So you have people who speak two different languages. None of them know a common second language. None of them can speak one or the other native language with each other. So what happens sometimes is they can just create a new language on the fly and use that just for basic communication. So these languages, which are created in these contact situations, are known as pidgins. And as you might guess, because they're a language which doesn't really exist until people make them up on the fly, they tend to have a simplified grammar and lexicon compared to most of the languages we see which are acquired natively. And like I said, these developed in many situations through centers of trade back in the old days when people were kind of exploring new horizons, and also, unfortunately, in slavery situations, which is also kind of an extension of that first situation as well. So I'll mention that one of the things that happened in slavery in the Americas, either in the Caribbean or the U.S. South or what have you, is that slaves were brought over from West Africa, largely speaking, but they were from a variety of different language groups. And so often what the slave owners would do in the New World is to try to put together slaves who did not speak the same language so that they couldn't sort of unify and fight and rise up against them. So to try to prevent them from being able to coordinate and communicate, they prevented them from speaking the same language, I guess to as much of an extent as they could. But in those situations, you can still just make up a new language, and that's what happened. So a lot of these pidgins emerged in that sort of scenario. I will say, though, this is to try to keep it somewhat positive. These languages or forms of language have emerged in sort of slavery or non-colonization settings as well. So actually in what I would call the Pacific Northwest, what you might as well call British Columbia, there was a Pidgin, or the next extension of that is going to be a Creole, which emerged between the various language groups in British Columbia and Washington State, so on and so forth, back before the Europeans ever got there. As you probably know, there's lots of mountains in that part of the world, and it's hard to get from one place to another. But, groups did get around and talk to each other, but they had sort of relatively isolated language situations when they were just talking to people in their native language, and when they'd encounter people from another group, they wouldn't be able to speak the same common language. But they did, over time, develop a form of Pidgin language to sort of conduct business with one another, because they wanted to trade different goods, as you know, kind of getting out of your own little valley in the mountains or whatever. You want to be able to encounter or make the best use of what somebody else has to offer, I guess, and so trade for that reason. So this sort of thing can happen in any sort of situation. It just historically has happened more often in some than others. So like I said, the initial form of this kind of a language is called a Pidgin. And this is a relatively simplified grammar with a few words basically used for business or basic communication. When a Pidgin is acquired by children as their native language, it becomes what is called a Creole. And so I've got one example here of Hawaiian Creole, which emerged in a complex trade setting in the 1800s. Before I get into that, I guess I should say that when a Pidgin is acquired by children, it becomes basically a fully fleshed out language with a grammar which is equally as complex as any other language's grammar, and a fully specified lexicon as well. You can say anything you want to in a Creole language. It just kind of has a different origin history than most of the languages that we know about. I will kind of qualify that last statement, though, and give you a couple of examples that we've already talked about. So when I talked about Nicaraguan Sign Language way back at the beginning of this class, that was a language which emerged when in Nicaragua they brought deaf children into sort of a central education system, and instead of the deaf children sort of being stuck in a setting where they had nobody to speak sign language with for most of their isolated lives, they could start speaking to one another. And they basically created what was like a Pidgin sign language when they first got it started, communicating with one another. And then as sort of younger kids came into the system and saw what the initial kids were doing, they kind of fleshed it out as well and made it more complicated, or a more enriched language, I guess you might say. Another interesting kind of situation, which is a bit of a stretch for this sort of discussion, but is still basically true, is how English itself was created. So as I mentioned, I think multiple times in this class, English is historically a Germanic language. If you go back 1,000 years ago, it was called Anglo-Saxon, or at least that's what we call it now. And it was pretty similar to the Germanic languages which were spoken at the time on the European continent. You can go back if you want to, and there's a classic text called Beowulf, or a classic story called Beowulf, which is written in that language. And it's, English in some historical sense, but it's basically unintelligible to us nowadays. And what happened with English is that the Normans, William the Conqueror, invaded England from France or Normandy and took over the country. And so the ruling class was the French-speaking Normans, and the sort of underclass were the Anglo-Saxon-speaking English. And what emerged out of that was kind of a combination language that has both French and English elements to it, which is the language we now know, because those two groups had to learn how to communicate with one another. And so we kind of got a mix for that reason. So you can kind of think of English as like a Pidgin or a Creole language. It's just been around for quite a long time. Hawaiian Creole is a language which hasn't been around for quite as long, but it emerged in the 1800s. So, yeah, you may or may not know about the history of Hawaii, but it was discovered in the late 1700s by Captain Cook on one of his many voyages around the Pacific Ocean. So the English got there first from Europe, but then many other different groups of people came there. The Americans got involved to try to control the islands, and they eventually won out. The Japanese were there, the Russians were there, so on and so forth, trying to get political control over the situation. Of course, the Hawaiians had been there for hundreds of years. There were also laborers that were imported from many different countries around the Pacific Rim. The idea was to be able to grow sugarcane there, so there was money involved. And also, Hawaii is a nice place, so why not take charge if you can? What this means, though, is there are a lot of people who spoke a lot of different languages in the same place, and they had to figure out how to communicate with each other. So what wound up happening is that this Pidgin language emerged first about 200 years ago, but over time, when children started acquiring it as a native language, it is a full-fledged Creole language. Because there is so much influence from the English and Americans there, a lot of the vocabulary of Hawaiian Creole is based on English, but it's not the same language. It plays by its own rules. I've got a note here that an English-based pidgin developed as a means of communication between the different groups, and I've got a sample to listen to. It's in here somewhere. So hopefully you did the quick write and got a sense of what the phonology of the language does to these English forms, but when you listen to it, it might sound a little bit more distinct from English than you expect.
Hey, how's it? Chawada. That's why hard. I said, try for think. What kind of story for tell you guys? I mean, talk all about me. She member. That's why maybe more better I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I talk. The kind of language I talk. Get about 500,000 people live Hawaii talk this language. And before us guys used to call them Pidgin English. And then by the English part went drop. So today everybody just tell Pidgin this, Pidgin that, like that. Plenty folks, they still yet think as one kind of broken English though. Sound like English as why. It's not, but Pidgin get uku plenty stuff's different. So it was just right they had him with the English part. But hard-headed people, real pakiki head them. Nah. They don't like believe Pidgin one real language. They don't know. Me, I know. Every time I hear something like, hey, go stay go, mama go stay come, mama you gonna be late. Makes sense for me. Try figure.
Yeah, so normally in class I'll ask people how much of that they understood, and my guess is that you understood probably some of it, but not all of it. I've listened to it a number of times over the years, so I can kind of decipher almost all of it, but it's basically actually a linguist from the University of Hawaii who's talking about this language which he speaks natively, and kind of the status it has in Hawaii, or basically the perception of it that people have. So as he says, it's people often refer to it or think of it as like a broken form of English, but it's not broken in any sense. Like I said, it just has its own rule set. So it's not like the speakers are trying to copy English but failing. They're just applying it to a whole new way of communicating with one another, using a lot of words which are similar to English but not the same. I've got another example. So another part of it, there's a social element to this too. So it's not the language of power in Hawaii, but a lot of people speak it anyways. And I've got an example here which is kind of fun of a group which has translated the Bible into what they call Hawaii Pidgin, but what we're calling Hawaiian Creole. And so this gives you a sense of what it looks like when it's written down. So I think generally speaking, it's not there's not a whole lot that's written in this language. It's mostly an oral form of communication, but you can still write it down if you want to. So this is the 23rd Psalm from the Bible. The boss above, he take care of me, just like the sheep farmer take care of sheeps. I'm sure my accent is not good, but this gives you a sense of what it's like. And I think there's somewhere here where you can search. Sorry. Yeah. So yeah, this is the general idea, but you should be able to. Yeah, read the Bible. That's it. So this is the whole Bible in web form. So going back to the beginning, God make the world, so on and so forth. Everything's in here if you're really curious to see what this is like. I gave you a smaller set of Hawaiian Creole data from the Quick Writes, and that was the goal here was to sort of just focus on phonology. So again, this is the language which is borrowing vocabulary from English and then applying Hawaiian Creole phonology to it. What happens? There's a lot in here. Normally, I kind of walk through this in class as a group so that because with many eyes on this, it's kind of easier to see all the different changes. I don't know if I'm going to walk through all the specifics in just by myself doing this. I might pause and then we can talk about it if we're going to watch this video together. But I'll point out a few things. Usually, the first thing that people notice is what happens to fricatives like the theta in think or the eth in this. So both of these become stops in Hawaiian Creole. So this one is a voiceless interdental fricative th, and it becomes a voiceless alveolar stop here. This one, the voiceless interdental fricative the, becomes a voiced interdental fricative in this, and that becomes a voiced alveolar stop. So the voicing is staying the same, whether it's voiceless or voiced. It just becomes a stop, and it's the nearest one in the neighborhood to an interdental fricative. They're both alveolar stops. And there are varieties of English where this happens as well. In fact, a lot of people in Minnesota do the exact same thing. You hear it in Irish English as well, so on and so forth. So we see that consistently. It's in a word like the as well, which becomes da. Other changes, a kind of notable one, which is in a lot of these forms, is what happens to the consonant R. So in some cases, like in parking or scared, the R just disappears. So this becomes parking, this becomes skade, so on and so forth. In other cases like sister, paper, or never, and I think that's all the ones that are relevant. There's no R at the end here, but we have an ah at the tail end where we might expect the R to be. So I told you guys to transcribe this like in sister or paper or never as a syllabic R, and it kind of looks like syllabic R is just changing into an ah in these particular cases. For four, there is sort of underlyingly an R here, but it just becomes full in Hawaiian Creole, so it disappears there too. It does not disappear in other forms though. So we have street, we have grocery, we have turis for street, grocery, and tourist. So the R sticks around there. So I'm not actually going to provide you with this answer, but you might want to think about, well, we have this one phoneme R in English, but then it has different forms in these different words in Hawaiian Creole English. We see it appearing as sort of different allophonic forms. Like, why does it stick around in street, grocery, and turis? And why is it going away in all these other words like fo, sista, pepa, so on and so forth? Is its disappearance in these forms the same thing as the disappearance we see in like parking and skade, so on and so forth? There's other differences too. So old becomes ol, tourist becomes turis, paint becomes pain. You might notice each one of these, there's a consonant disappearing at the tail end of the word. So in cases where we get multiple consonants at the end of a word, the last one disappears, at least in these three examples. It doesn't happen in think, though. Like, why would it happen in old, tourist, and paint, but not in think? I'll also point out that we kind of have two consonants at the end of scared, but the R is the one disappearing here and not the one at the end. Over here, we have the consonants at the end disappearing, but not the one right before the end. Here, it's the one right before the end, which goes away. Can you explain how that works? I think those are most of the consonantal changes that I can see here. I'll also point out, though, like in street, Hawaiian Creole speakers do the same thing that Tina Fey did, and they pronounce that S as a sh, so street rather than street. There's also some interesting vowel changes here, like the in, this becomes dis, so on and so forth, or the open O and for becomes O, so on and so forth. Yeah, you don't need to describe those necessarily. I just kind of want you to notice them and then also think about how you would describe the consonant changes based on the phonological rules that we've been talking about. Yeah, there's a lot there. So that's why it's fun to study languages like that, which kind of applies to every single language in the world, but I know I'm biased. We are going to talk about the phonology of a lot of different languages by doing practice exercises and also homeworks for phonology. So the next step, now that we kind of have a sense of how this is supposed to work, is to try our hand at a few of these problems. So I've got a step-by-step guide for you guys to walk through this process. So in a lot of these questions, I'm going to present you with a data set from a language which shows you here's how you say this set of words in this particular language, whatever it might be. And I want you to focus on like 2 or more sounds in the language and tell me if they have some sort of relationship with one another. So the first thing you should do is determine the distribution of those sounds. And the tip I will give you is to do sort of what I was doing with the color coding before on the slides. But normally what I would do is like write this out on the board. So I'd say for every word in which you find the sound, write down the sounds that both precede and follow it. And then looking at that environment, you can maybe start to see if there's any commonalities in the environment, if there's any sort of consistent pattern you get in the sounds that precede and follow the sound that you're looking at. So you can also look at if there are differences, there are consistent differences between the 2 sounds you're considering. Are the 2 sounds ever found in the same phonetic environment? If the answer to that is yes, then you do not have complementary distribution, but you have to figure out what other sort of distribution you might have. So you'd look in that case, you'd look for a minimal pair. Do you ever find the 2 sounds contrasting between otherwise identical words? If yes, then you have contrastive phonemes. And if not, then that means they are in free variation. Basically, this yes case here is where you have a minimal pair, like bit versus pit. That's the easiest example for this sort of problem set. And you just say, well, there are 2 different phonemes. Here's a minimal pair which documents that they are distinct sounds in the language. If not, if you get sort of like one word which can be pronounced in multiple different ways, then that means that these 2 sounds are in free variation. Usually, like I said before, the fun part is where you get sounds that are never in the same phonetic environment in a language. That means that they're in complementary distribution, and that means that they are allophones of the same phoneme, or at least generally speaking, that's what you can assume on the basis of that distribution. If that happens, you need to determine which allophone is the basic one and which allophone is the restricted allophone. The way you do that is that you say the basic allophone is the one that's found in the widest variety of phonetic environments, and the restricted allophone is the one that's found only in a specific phonetic environment or a smaller set of phonetic environments. Once you figure that out, what you have to do is just write a rule that accounts for when you get one allophone versus the other. And the way to write out that rule is to say that you have the basic allophone, which you put in slash brackets, and you say that changes into the restricted allophone, which you write in square brackets. And then slash, you put it in whatever the appropriate environment is where you find the restricted allophone. That's the basic mechanism for how to do these problems, or basically like the flow chart you could use to figure out how this works. The tricky part, though, is just sort of making that leap, that jump to conclusions part of this, which is to see the pattern. So often the hardest part of a phonology problem can be figuring out what the phonetic environment is that conditions the phonological change. And that gets easier with practice and once you see a few examples of this. But I guess I would encourage you as you're getting started to, like I said, jump to conclusions. And if you think you see a pattern, say it's a pattern and then try to prove yourself wrong. Yeah, it's the easiest way to kind of test your hypothesis to find out if there really is something going on in the language and whether or not you have some sort of phonological rule at play. I think that's all I'm going to say about this for now, but as usual, if you have questions, you should feel free to ask because we're here to learn. And also give all these practice exercises a shot. That's the best way to figure out how to walk through this process. Okay, I'm done with this for now. We'll talk a little bit more about other patterns we see in phonology in terms of what we call natural classes in our next lecture. So I'll see you guys then.